The parsha, the haftara is the parsha of Chanun, and it's always Shabbos נחמו, the Shabbos of comfort. And it's the second parsha in the Chumash Dvorim. In the final Chumash, it's the second parsha. And it introduces the seven parshios, the seven haftaros that are called the Shiva the Nechemta, the seven haftaros of comfort. All seven are taken from the prophet Yeshayahu. All seven deal with the comforting of the Jewish people, with the messianic vision of the world, with the understanding of how the Jewish people will come to their greatness and to their appointed end of redemption and of rebuilding the temple and of being the inspiration for the world. So that's the parsha of Chanun, and it's the haftarah of Shabbos נחמו. The haftarah begins, נחמו, נחמו, Ami. נחמו, נחמו, Ami Yomar Elohechem. Be comforted, my people, says your God. So the rabbis immediately comment that in the haftarah that was the haftarah of Shabbos Chazon, the haftarah of the indictment of the Jewish people, so it mentions that the Jewish people were smitten twice. Luksa b'kiflayim. The Jewish people were hit a double blow, a compounded blow. And therefore, because they were struck a compounded blow, they were hit twice. So therefore, the comfort also has to be a double comfort. It has to be more than the usual comfort. We can understand this exactly literally, because since our exile has lasted so long and so many terrible things have happened, so to speak, the expectation or the reward at the end of this terribly long tunnel, every time troubles happen to us, then the expectation of the reward increases, because what perhaps would have been worth a great deal in a short exile is not worth that much in a long exile, and what would have been sufficient comfort 100 years ago is certainly not sufficient comfort after what has happened to us in the last century. So therefore the comfort has to be doubled, it has to be compounded, it has to be greater, and that's what the Navi means here when he says נחמו, נחמו. The word נחמו also, when it is used twice, is used for emphasis, for strengthening. Strengthen your comfort. We're talking about a great comfort. The Mephoshim also point out that the comfort of a person, a great deal of the comfort of a person naturally is dependent on external circumstances, but a great deal of the comfort of a person is dependent on the person's own inner psychological makeup. There are people who can be consoled, and there are people who are inconsolable. And there are people who have a psychological makeup that they can forget, that they can forge ahead, and they somehow are able to take it. But that's the greatness of the Jewish people. That's why God says, נחמו, נחמו, Ami, from you yourself the comfort will come. Dabru alei Yerushalayim. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem. We have here the personification of Yerushalayim, the city as being a person, not merely being an abstract place, and not merely being a set of buildings or streets, but the Lev Yerushalayim, it's the heart of Jerusalem. It is a personality, it's a living organism all unto itself, and it's representative of the Jewish people. Ikirei leha, call to it. Now who's he speaking to? He's speaking to the Jewish people. The Jewish people themselves should talk to themselves, should heal themselves, should speak to Yerushalayim. Because it's tzvaha is its term has expired. Its its prison sentence, its time of servitude has been filled. Kimola tzva'a. Tzva'a is the time of servitude. The time that it has been exiled, the time has expired. Kinirtza avona. Its sin has been forgiven. So our rabbis say that the idea that I've mentioned to you a number of times before, that the redemption of the Jewish people can come because the time is here or because we have earned it. Be'ita achishena. It comes be'ita in its appointed time. So if it comes in its appointed time, it doesn't make any difference what the Jewish people are. It can be the most unworthy of generations. But the time is up. In business, they say everything is timing, right? So sometimes it happens that an idiot makes a good investment because he bought it at the right time, right? And the genius can come in at the wrong time and make the same investment and lose everything. Well, in the history, there also is an element of timing, the right time. There's a time for it. And that's the idea, Kimola tzvo. Its time is up. So that doesn't make any difference what the Jewish people are. If the time is up, then the time is up. And then the other level is kinirtza avona. Its sins are forgiven. Well, that depends on the Jewish people already. That's not dependent on the time. That's dependent on the behavior and the actions of the Jewish people. If they have erased their sins, so then that also marks the moment of comfort and consolation. Then God will redeem us. The Kotzker Rebbe was rumored to have said, one of his famous aphorisms, he stole, this is in the 1840s, 1850s, so he said to God, he said, bring Mashiach now, because it isn't going to get better. There's nothing to wait for. They're not going to get any better. To a certain extent, he was right. So there is that element, right, that the time is here, it's here, right? We can't do much more. And kinirtza avona is that if everybody would do tshuva. Ki lokcha miyad Hashem kiflayim bechol chatoseho. It has taken from the hand of God, again, a double punishment. Worse than its sins. So all the commentators ask, how can you say that about God, that God should punish doubly more than what the sins are? God is exact in his judgment. So the Meforshim say here a very deep thought, which again is very relevant to our times, and that is that the punishment of God is exact. It's just. It's perfect. There's not anything extra. But the punishment is so enormous that the human mind and the human observer thinks that there are no sins that can sustain such a verdict, that justify such a punishment. But there's no question that somehow in God's cosmic sense of justice, the Holocaust is justified. But to us, it is hard to imagine what justifies 1.5 million children being destroyed. What sin requires that expiation? So that's why the Novi phrases it this way. He doesn't phrase it in terms of the fact that God forbid, is not just. God is just, and the justice is perfect. Everything that God does is just. But we, in our finite minds, in our limitations, we can't see it. It's just too much for us to bear. So we therefore say to God that the blow is twice as much as it should have been. The blows the Jewish people have sustained are double the amount, they're much more than what they should have received for their sins. So the first voice of comfort is the voice, the inner voice that God directs to us. נחmo, נחmo ami. Console yourselves. That's the first voice of comfort. Now there's a second voice of comfort. Kol korei bamidbar. is a voice that cries out in the desert. Also remarkable imagery. There's a voice crying in the English translation is a cry in the wilderness, right? So we know what that means. A cry in the wilderness means an unheeded cry. You talk to no one. No one is home to hear what you have to say. But there is a voice in the desert. Well, the desert is not, in Jewish terms, the desert is not the wilderness. That's one of the great mistranslations. And the wilderness in English always refers to an uninhabited, desolate place that has no fond memory, so to speak. The desert for the Jewish people is our first home. It's where we began a 40-year sojourn in the desert. The desert is where we accepted the Torah. The desert is where we were fed by the holy mun from heaven and the miraculous well of Miriam. So the desert is a special place. And where in the Tanakh we see the word used, midbar, we do not always connect that with an evil and desolate place, but rather a lonely place where the nations of the world don't hear anything, but the Jewish people heard something. The nations of the world did not accept the Torah, the Jewish people did accept the Torah. So the Kol Koreh Bamidbar, the voice that cries in the desert, that's God's voice. That's the voice of prophecy. That's the voice of the history of the Jewish people. That's the voice of Sinai. Calls to us and says, Panu derech Hashem. Let us clear the path for God. Let us clear God's pathway. We have, in other words, let's prepare for the Mashiach. It's part of the process of comfort is that we will prepare for the Mashiach. We will somehow clear the path for God. Apparently, from the Navi, we see that we have to do something. We have to, God, once God gets on the path, so to speak, He'll do everything necessary. But we are the ones that have to somehow bring it into being, and then it will have its own momentum. Then it's unstoppable. Yashru ba'areva, make straight in the areva. The areva is again it's a description of a desert. The arava in the land of Israel is that part of the Jordan Valley which is south of the Dead Sea and flows into the Gulf of Eilat. It's in the Jordan Valley, but there's no more Jordan River there. There it's only the rift, only the deep valley. So that's called the Arava. That's all desert. So straighten a path again in the desert, Mesila Elokeinu, a highway for our God. Pave a road for the Rabboni Shalom. The word Mesila is like the word Mesilas Yeshorim, right? The path of the righteous, the highway of the righteous. Kol Gei Yinaseh, V'chol Har V'giva Yishpelu. When God comes, all the high places will be lowered, and all the low places will be raised. It gives you an imagery of building a highway, which hasn't changed, right? You bring enormous land-moving equipment, and what you do is you taper the hills and you raise the valleys so that you don't have very steep grades. You don't have to go up and down, but rather you have a level surface. The idea here, however, is that this refers to nations. The great nations will be humbled and the small nations will be raised. There'll be a parity among nations. And there'll also be a parity amongst people. The discrepancies, the disparities in life will not be so pronounced. You have countries in the world where 98% of the wealth of the country is owned by 1% of the population. That country is in problems. That has trouble. You have to get a more equitable distribution. Ha'okov l'mishor. Ha'okov means the crooked, serpentine, twist curves will become straight. God will straighten them. And the Farshim say that refers